Welcome to Building Better, the series where I iterate and improve on my life while documenting what I've learned along the way. Today we're talking about journaling in 5 parts, but there are a few rules you want to get through first. First, journaling requires you to be sincere and honest with yourself. Brutal honesty has no place here since we are all hopefully changing and evolving people who can't be reduced to a harsh sentence or two. Second, journaling ought not to be forced. Some people can habituate it, others can't, and that's just fine. The line between pushing through discomfort and forcing the ideas onto a page is fuzzy, but we should err on the former rather than the latter. That being said, we'll be going over the topic in 5 parts: why we journal in the first place, how to find truth and wisdom in others and ourselves, how to incubate our thoughts to make sure they're reasonable and well considered, how to build self mastery through a journal from the perspective of life, not productivity, and when to best journal for different results. Part 1: Why journal? Rubber duck debugging is the practice of explaining code in plain language to a rubber duck and checking that explanation against what's actually been written in order to catch any bugs and mistakes in the logic or structure of the code. It's generally the second or third tool in a programmer's toolkit to get through a plateau where no progress is made and things aren't working the way they should. The practice is based on the principle that slowing down and structuring our thoughts in order to communicate them strengthens our understanding and forces clarity onto the information. It exposes our gaps and forces us to address them. In learning, this is used in the Feynman technique, but it has another application for self development: journaling. At its core, journaling is about gaining awareness over and likely changing our own behavior. It's about continually reflecting and digesting ideas and experiences into something that can help guide us through life. It doesn't have to be a set of rules or a handbook, though it can be, and all we need to do is to have something to write on, something to write with, and something to write about. Behavior change is a complicated topic, but I'll do my best to communicate what I know about it before we get into the various journaling systems that exist out there. First, we should be aware that change happens mostly under the hood. It's a subconscious process that demands a lot of energy and attention if we want it to take place at all. Just like nobody has gotten their best hypertrophy results from lifting light far from failure on different exercises every single day, nobody has made progress on themselves by binging self help and self development content all day, every day. No amount of external advice can substitute for internal experiences that have been digested with time and rest. This doesn't mean that journaling should be intermittent. In fact, journaling is best when it's made into a habit because this repeated exposure to the same patterns of contemplation, analysis, and self understanding will increase the chances that your journaling will yield lasting results in your mind. Journaling is also a tool to preserve our autonomy and therefore sense of self efficacy, which is known to improve performance and well being in basically every area of life where we are primarily responsible for our own behavior. Essentially, having a safe, private, and consistent place to contemplate challenging ideas and problems in a process of analysis, prediction, and acceptance builds resilience to outside stressors, calms anxiety, quiets your ego, and increases the chance that we make good decisions that we are then likely to repeat. Journaling allows us to gain awareness over our ability to steer the ship of our mind and to eventually chart our own courses. For more information, see these videos by Dr. K, but for now let's talk about a somewhat atypical angle for journaling. Part 2: Journaling to Find Truth. Truth is an odd word. There's an internal sense of truth, external sources of truth, and most importantly for our discussion, individual truths. In lofty terms, wisdom is the ability to reconcile one's individual truths about their experience, psychology, and tendencies with the wider facts of the world. Journaling in this context is less of a practice that builds wisdom wholesale, but instead a practice that facilitates the process of accumulating wisdom from a wide variety of sources. For this, we can consider 4 kinds of journal. Streams of consciousness are unstructured dumps of the contents of the brain at the time of writing, and then any additional thoughts that pop up. There are plenty of reasons to do streams of consciousness. For creatives, it helps to fully voice and then bypass the inner critic. For those with busy schedules, it helps to decompress the sheer number of tasks bouncing around in their skull. And for those who deal with alexithymia, it builds familiarity with being present in the moment and their inner experience. The basic principle is that our thoughts are full of noise, and by writing them down, we can tune into the signal that's buried deep in there. Guided reflections are slightly more structured than streams of consciousness, using media like art, music, movies, and literature as subjects of analysis to springboard off into deeper personal reflection. The media that we consume can be extremely meaningful and insightful, And diving into how and why that is the case for us can be a great place to start off on some self analysis and gaining self knowledge. Capture logs are incidental journals, meaning that they are meant to be filled from moment to moment as the need arises. Capture logs are meant for stray thoughts, distractions, and to dos that pop up throughout any given day so that they can be offloaded without taking up any of our precious mental resources. Commonplace books are also incidental journals, though the aim is to collect and organize interesting and resonant quotes that we encounter as we read and experience media. We can, of course, reflect on and expand on these quotes with our own contributions. The repository nature of commonplace books allows us to examine and connect these quotes, understanding why they resonated with us, and just as importantly, how they parallel, support, and add nuance to each other. Important to note is that commonplace books aren't a core journal. They're supplementary and supportive to our thinking that's cultivated in our other journals, including the following. Part 3, Journaling to Incubate Thoughts. If our thoughts are mostly noisy and we can only tune into the valuable signal with time or effort, then we need to figure out how to accumulate this time and effort without losing progress like we do with streams of consciousness. The option of rereading and re immersing ourselves in our thinking again is always available, but rather time consuming. Instead, we have the option to record our thoughts in a more structured way that lets us bypass the noise entirely. For these purposes, we have three types of journal. Deep thinking is the act of recording, tracing, refuting, and constructing arguments for our own thoughts. This isn't antagonistic, but done in good faith and out of curiosity. We don't want to go so far as to write academic papers or essays, though those do serve their purpose as a learning tool. But we do want to know our sources, both literary and experiential. Our thinking is generally littered with biases and assumptions, and while no amount of deep thinking will get rid of those, developing a greater awareness and nuance of those biases and assumptions is likely to limit their influence over our decision making. Anonymous letters aren't really meant to be sent, read, or addressed toward any particular person, though they certainly can be. The benefit of writing anonymously with the knowledge that this information will stay private is that it implicitly gives us permission to be more vulnerable and genuine. Deep thinking is useful, but I would characterize it as prone to intellectualizing and detachment, which serves its purpose, but these letters enable the kind of raw expression that can be extremely useful for exposing our philosophical blind spots. A step beyond the anonymous letter is the soliloquy, which is a back and forth between the writer and the writer. Essentially, it's a dialogue in which we take two opposing or complementary sides that debate, teach, or otherwise constructively challenge each other to reach a beneficial conclusion. This is a fairly old philosophical practice, one that can disentangle internal conflict into two sides without demonizing or elevating either side of the discussion. Writing a soliloquy can feel like directing a scene with two characters because that's kind of what's happening. It's part creative writing exercise, part diary, all expression and interrogation of our ideas, which is precisely what we want out of our thought incubators because it allows us to truly understand ourselves and act from a place of confidence and authenticity. Or, in other words, part 4, journaling for self mastery. We want to hold at the front of our minds that self mastery is not necessarily unshakable discipline with monk like restraint and control. Self mastery for our purposes is instead the capacity to write an honest autobiography and with confidence to shape the direction that it will go in. We are creatures of narrative who make sense of the world and ourselves through stories, the cause and effect. We aren't in control of a great deal of our stories. Socioeconomic status and external bigotry manifesting in legislature can't be solved with any number of journals, and they are definitely core factors in many people's stories. We can't choose what happens to us. All we can do is shape our processing of those events and do things that will slowly tip the scales of our environment while maintaining our sense of autonomy and self efficacy. The ability to shape the former such that we can reliably perform the latter is our working definition of self mastery for the sake of this video. To build self mastery, we're looking at four types of journal. Niken is a Zen Buddhist journaling system that asks us to answer three questions as objectively as we can. What did we receive today? What did we give today? And how did we inconvenience somebody today? The objective is to be as objective and detached from emotional assumption and inference as possible. It's a framework to focus on the objective impact of the world on us and our objective impact on the world. The goal is to trace the chain of why something happened in the way that it did and figure out which link we can insert our autonomy into such that we can shift the chain as a whole. Diaries are the premier tool for emotional digestion, pioneered by teenage girls and American philosopher Gregory Heffley. Emotions are difficult to process, particularly for men for whom alexithymia, or the inability to recognize one's internal state, is the norm. Emotions don't really go away on their own. Instead, we need to name and acknowledge an emotion no matter how ugly or shame bound it may be. Moments of tragedy and perceived failure are especially hard to process healthily due to that tendency towards shame. These scenarios demand a hefty dose of cognitive reframing to find the win in a mistake before affirming our goal to improve, to ask ourselves in what ways we can grow and change after an event, and to choose one that feels resonant with our values. Narrative framing is the act of pattern matching our recurring struggles, habits, and joys with our past to better understand how we got to where we are and what that means for us. Personal understanding is rooted in the stories that we tell ourselves, and as we write, we can choose to divest from our bias and the absolutist parts of our ego. If every day is its own story, what does that story say about us, and how can we shape it? Personal auditing is a way to examine what we perceive as success and failure, and more importantly, why we view them that way. It's a framework that asks us to deconstruct and dissect the how and why of any success or failure from an objective standpoint. After this examination, we list our obligations and what we want to do with our time, paying attention to how they advance our goals. We want to remind ourselves that not everything has to be a big step. Not everything even needs to push our engine harder. Plenty of it can exist just to keep the engine in good, clean condition. The question of how to set goals is more complex than this video can fit, so we're just going to move on to part 5, when to journal. Journaling takes time and focus, something that's generally in short supply and requires some reallocation of our resources. Practically speaking, the best times to journal are first thing in the morning or right before bed. Morning pages are a journaling practice created and popularized by Julia Cameron. It's a stream of consciousness in its original design, but at its core is agnostic to the journaling method precisely. The benefit of the morning pages is to clear and center our minds in a sense of self efficacy as soon as possible after waking so that we can buckle down and tackle our goals in whatever way we see fit. Alternatively, or even additionally, we can journal before sleeping, which can improve sleep quality and more deeply encode our reflections into our practices and behaviors. It turns out there's value to the idea of sleeping on an idea, and journaling at night before bed can leverage this process to our benefit. We've run out of time, but before we finish, know that the exact methods and times that compose our journaling practices should be self determined instead of prescribed. There is, by definition, no one correct answer to living in life, only tools and practices used by individual people. Thank you for watching, and see you next time for the next installment of Building Better.